The dust stirred beneath Bryce Keller's boots as he stood on the porch of his isolated ranch house, squinting at the horizon where the Colorado sun was beginning to set. It was 1878, and 5 years had passed since he'd lost everything that mattered in Black Hawk, a mining town that had once promised him gold but delivered only heartbreak. Another day gone, he muttered to himself, the words carried away by the wind that swept across the valley. His ranch, 30 miles outside of town, was exactly what he wanted. Remote, quiet, and free from reminders of the life he'd once hoped to build, Bryce ran a calloused hand over his unshaven face. At 32, he'd grown harder than the rocky soil he worked. The local folks in Black Hawk had taken to calling him the Hermit, though not within earshot if they could help it. His reputation as a sharpshooter and his imposing 6'2" frame ensured that even the bravest kept their distance. Inside, he stoked the fire and prepared a simple meal. The cabin was sparse but functional: a bed, a table, a few chairs, and shelves lined with books that rarely saw use anymore. On the mantel sat a single photograph in a silver frame, face down. He hadn't looked at it in years, but couldn't bring himself to throw it away. As night fell, he sat by the window with his Winchester across his lap, a habit formed after years of vigilance. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and outlaws occasionally passed through these parts. A man alone had to stay alert. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it always did. Dreams of smoke and shouting, of promises made and broken, plagued him until dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and gold. He rose, splashed cold water on his face, and prepared for another day of solitude. The morning brought an unexpected change to his routine. As Bryce stepped out to feed the horses, he noticed a plume of dust in the distance. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. He returned to the house, retrieved his Winchester, and waited. The approaching rider was pushing their horse hard, too hard for these rocky trails. As they drew closer, Bryce realized it was a woman, bent low over the saddle, her dark hair streaming behind her. She reached the fence line and practically fell from her mount, stumbling toward his porch. "Help," she gasped, clutching her side. "Please." Before Bryce could respond, she collapsed at the foot of his steps. Instinct overcame caution as he rushed to her side, setting his rifle against the porch rail. She was breathing but unconscious. A quick examination revealed no obvious injuries, though exhaustion was written plainly across her face. With reluctance, he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected and carried her into the house, placing her on the bed. He removed her boots, but nothing more, drawing a blanket over her still form. Her face was streaked with dust, but he could see she was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with features that might be called pretty in different circumstances. Bryce retreated to the porch, unsure what to do next. Her horse needed tending, so he led the exhausted animal to the barn, removing its saddle and providing water and feed. The saddlebags contained some clothing, a small pouch of money, and a folded letter addressed to Madeline Darnell in Black Hawk. No weapons, which struck him as peculiar for someone traveling alone. When he returned to the house, she was still unconscious. He pulled a chair to the corner of the room and settled in to wait, Winchester across his knees. Whoever she was, whatever trouble pursued her, he wanted no part of it. He would offer basic hospitality and send her on her way as soon as possible. Hours passed before she stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the color of summer sage. She tried to sit up, then winced. "Don't move too quick," Bryce said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe for now." She stared at him, fear and confusion warring on her face. "Where am I?" "My ranch, 30 miles east of Black Hawk." He remained in his corner, maintaining distance. "You rode in hard and collapsed. Want to tell me what you're running from?" Her hand went to her side and she winced again. I wasn't." She took a breath. "My name is Madeline Darnell. I'm looking for work in Black Hawk." "You're headed the wrong direction," Bryce said flatly. "Town's west of here. I got lost," she admitted, 2 days ago. "Then some men started following me yesterday. I've been riding hard since dawn." Bryce's eyes narrowed. "What men?" "I don't know, 3 of them, rough-looking." She pushed herself up slowly, grimacing. "They kept their distance, but they were definitely tracking me." This was exactly the kind of trouble Bryce had been avoiding for years. "Well, Miss Darnell, you can rest here tonight. Tomorrow I'll point you in the right direction for Black Hawk," she nodded, relief evident in her posture. "Thank you, Mr. Keller, Bryce Keller." Recognition flashed in her eyes, quickly masked. "Thank you, Mr. Keller, I promise I won't be a burden." Bryce stood and moved to the door. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. I'll fix something to eat." He paused, then added, "Lock the door while I'm out." Outside, Bryce scanned the horizon carefully. No sign of pursuers yet, but that didn't mean they weren't coming. He checked his rifle, then walked the perimeter of his property, alert for anything unusual. Finding nothing, he returned to the small smokehouse behind the cabin and retrieved some jerky and dried beans. When he knocked on his own door, he heard the lock slide before Madeline opened it. She'd washed her face and tied back her dark hair, though her clothes were still dusty from the trail. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table as he set about preparing a simple meal. They ate in silence, Madeline casting occasional glances his way. Bryce focused on his food, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "You don't get many visitors," she observed finally. "It wasn't a question. No." "Yet you took me in," Bryce shrugged. "Couldn't leave you lying in the dirt." "Some would have." She studied him openly now. "You've been alone a long time." His jaw tightened. "Miss Darnell, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not interested in conversation. You needed help, I provided it." "That's all," she nodded, returning her attention to her plate. "Of course, I apologize." Night fell quickly. Bryce made a pallet for himself on the floor near the fireplace, insisting Madeline take the bed. He slept lightly, aware of her presence in a way that disturbed his usual routine. Before dawn, he rose and stepped outside to check the horizon again. Still clear, breakfast was coffee and hardtack. Madeline seemed stronger, the color returned to her cheeks. She insisted on helping with the morning chores, efficiently feeding the chickens while Bryce tended the horses. "Your mount needs rest," he told her as they worked, "but I can loan you one of mine to reach Black Hawk. You can stable him at Turner's livery and send him back with the next mail coach." "That's very generous," Madeline said. "I'm not sure how to thank you." "No need." Bryce saddled a sturdy bay gelding for her. "Stay on the main trail heading west. You'll reach town by mid-afternoon if you keep a steady pace." Madeline mounted easily, settling into the saddle with the confidence of someone raised around horses. She looked down at him, hesitating. "Mr. Keller, I feel I should warn you. Those men who were following me, they might come this way." "I can handle myself." He handed her the reins. "Good luck in Black Hawk." She opened her mouth as if to say more, then simply nodded. "Thank you again, Mr. Keller." With that, she turned the horse and rode toward the trail. Bryce watched until she disappeared from view, a curious emptiness settling in his chest. He dismissed it, returning to his chores with single-minded focus. By midday, he'd almost convinced himself the encounter was already forgotten. 3 days passed in the familiar routine of ranch work. Bryce repaired fencing, tended his small herd of cattle, and kept to himself. On the 4th morning, as he chopped wood behind the cabin, the sound of approaching horses caught his attention. He set down the axe and moved to retrieve his rifle from the porch. 3 riders appeared on the trail, moving at a leisurely pace. They were exactly as Madeline had described, rough-looking men with hard faces and well-worn weapons. Bryce stepped into view, Winchester held casually but ready. "That's far enough," he called when they were within earshot. The men halted, exchanging glances before the leader, a bearded man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, spoke. "We're looking for a woman, dark hair, traveling alone. Name's Madeline Darnell. Seen her? What's your business with her?" Bryce asked, ignoring the question. "Family matter," the scarred man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Her brother sent us to find her. She's confused, needs to come home." The lie was transparent. Bryce kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description." The scarred man studied him for a long moment. "Mind if we look around? She might have passed through without you knowing." "I mind," Bryce said evenly. "This is private property." "Listen, friend," the man's tone hardened. "We don't want trouble, but we need to find this woman. It's important." "Then I suggest you keep looking elsewhere." Bryce shifted slightly, making sure they could see he was prepared to use his rifle if necessary. The three men conferred briefly, then the leader nodded. "All right, sorry to bother you." As they turned their horses, he added, "If you do see her, tell her Jeb Carter is looking for her. It's in her best interest to come find me." Bryce watched them leave, maintaining his vigilance until they were well out of sight. Something about the encounter troubled him deeply. Whatever Madeline Darnell was involved in, it was serious enough that these men were willing to threaten a stranger to find her. For the next 2 days, Bryce found himself distracted, his thoughts returning to Madeline despite his efforts to focus on his work. On the third day, as dusk approached, he heard a horse approaching a single rider moving at a steady pace. He positioned himself on the porch, rifle ready, as the figure came into view. It was Madeline, riding his bay gelding. She reined in at the fence line, appearing uncertain whether to proceed. "Miss Darnell," he called, "didn't expect to see you again." "May I approach, Mr. Keller?" she called back. He hesitated, then nodded. As she rode closer, he could see the tension in her posture. She dismounted and led the horse the final few yards. "I'm sorry to impose again," she said, stopping at the foot of the steps. "But I didn't know where else to go." "Those men came looking for you," Bryce said. 3 days ago." She paled visibly. "Did they? What did they say?" "Said your brother sent them, called themselves family." Bryce studied her reaction. "I told them I hadn't seen you." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, they're not family. They're hired guns working for a man named Carson Blake." The name triggered a flicker of recognition. Blake was a wealthy businessman in Denver with political aspirations and a reputation for ruthlessness. "And what does Carson Blake want with you?" Madeline hesitated, her hands twisting the reins. "It's complicated. I worked for his household in Denver. I left, abruptly." "With something that wasn't yours?" Bryce asked bluntly. "No." Her eyes flashed with indignation. "With information about his business dealings, things I overheard that he wouldn't want made public." Bryce sighed heavily. This was exactly the kind of trouble he'd been avoiding for years. "Miss Darnell, I sympathize with your situation, but please," she interrupted. "Just one more night. Tomorrow I'll move on, I promise. Those men are in Black Hawk now. I can't go back there yet." Against his better judgment, Bryce nodded. "One night. Then we figure out where you can go that isn't here." Relief softened her features. "Thank you." They settled into an uneasy coexistence for the evening. Madeline helped prepare dinner, moving around his kitchen with surprising ease. She spoke little, respecting his preference for silence, but her presence filled the cabin in a way that was both intrusive and oddly comforting. As they ate, Bryce found himself studying her more closely, the determined set of her jaw, the careful way she chose her words, the intelligence in her eyes. She was nothing like Sarah had been, yet something about her presence stirred memories he'd thought long buried. "Why Black Hawk?" he asked suddenly. "If you were running from Denver, why come to a mining town?" Madeline seemed surprised by the question after their long silence. "My aunt lived there when I was a child. After my parents died, I spent a few summers with her." She looked down at her plate. "She's gone now, but I remembered it as a place where I felt safe once." "And what were you planning to do there?" "Find work, maybe as a teacher or a shopkeeper's assistant." She met his gaze. "I have some education. And I need to stay in one place long enough to figure out what to do with what I know." Bryce set down his fork. "What exactly do you know that has Blake sending men after you?" She hesitated, then said, "He's been selling defective equipment to mining operations throughout Colorado. Equipment that fails catastrophically. Last year, the collapse at the Silverton mine that killed 23 men, that was because of his inferior support beams." The information hit Bryce like a physical blow. His brother had died in that collapse, leaving a wife and 2 small children behind. "You're certain of this?" Madeline nodded. "I kept his books. The records are clear he used substandard materials and pocketed the difference. But he also paid off inspectors to certify the equipment. It's all documented, and I have copies." "And you think exposing him will stop him?" "I have to try." Her voice was soft but determined. "Too many have died already." Bryce stared into the fire, his mind racing. Part of him wanted nothing to do with this. He'd left that world of corruption and injustice behind years ago. But the thought of his brother's death being the result of one man's greed burned through his carefully constructed detachment. "Those men won't stop looking," he said finally. "And Blake has connections, judges, lawmen. Even if you find someone willing to listen, there's no guarantee of justice." "I know," she looked at him steadily, "but I can't live with myself if I do nothing." They lapsed into silence again, but it was different now, charged with unspoken possibilities. When Madeline finally rose to retire, she paused by his chair. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. Not just for the shelter, but for listening. It's been a long time since I could speak the truth to anyone." Bryce nodded, unable to form an adequate response. As she disappeared behind the bedroom door, he remained by the fire, turning over everything she'd told him. Sleep would be elusive tonight. Morning brought clarity, if not peace. Bryce rose before dawn and stepped outside to watch the sun rise over the mountains. By the time Madeline emerged from the cabin, he'd made his decision. "Those men will come back," he said without preamble. "Probably with more." "This place isn't safe for you anymore," she nodded, resignation in her eyes. "I know, I'll leave as soon as possible." "We'll leave," Bryce corrected her. "There's a marshal in Sterling I know from before, a good man who can't be bought. If your evidence is solid, he'll help." Surprise registered on her face. Mr. Keller, I can't ask you to, you didn't ask," he interrupted. "Blake's equipment killed my brother in that Silverton collapse. This became my fight when you told me that." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "I'm sorry about your brother." "So am I." Bryce turned toward the barn. "Pack whatever you brought. We leave in an hour." They traveled north, keeping off the main trails. Bryce led them through terrain he knew well from hunting expeditions, rocky passes, and dense forests that would make pursuit difficult. They spoke little during the journey, each absorbed in their own thoughts. As night approached, Bryce found a sheltered clearing near a small stream. "We'll camp here," he said, dismounting. "Sterling's still 2 days' ride." They worked efficiently to set up camp, Madeline gathering firewood while Bryce tended the horses. As darkness fell, they sat beside the small fire, eating jerky and hardtack from Bryce's provisions. "You know these mountains well," Madeline observed, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Grew up in them," Bryce replied. "My father was a trapper before he tried his hand at mining. He taught my brother and me how to live off the land." "And your family now?" "Don't have one," Bryce stared into the flames. "My parents died of influenza 12 years back. My brother Daniel was all I had left until Silverton." Madeline was quiet for a moment. "What was he like, your brother?" The question caught Bryce off guard. It had been so long since he'd spoken of Daniel to anyone. "He was better than me, kinder, always saw the good in people." A rare smile ghosted across his face. "Terrible poker player, though, couldn't bluff to save his life. You miss him." "Every day," Bryce added another stick to the fire. "He left a wife and 2 kids. They moved back east to her family after we lost him." "Is that why you live alone? Because you lost everyone?" The question was too direct, too personal. Bryce felt his walls rising again. "We should get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow." Madeline seemed to sense she'd pushed too far. "Of course. Good night, Mr. Keller." "Bryce," he said after a moment. "If we're traveling together, might as well use my given name." She smiled softly. "Good night, Bryce. I'm Madeline, or Maddie to friends." "Night, Madeline," he replied, deliberately using her full name. Friends wasn't something he was looking for. The night passed uneventfully, and they set out again at first light. The terrain grew rougher as they continued north, forcing them to move more slowly than Bryce would have liked. By midday, dark clouds were gathering over the mountains. "Storm's coming," Bryce observed, scanning the horizon. "We need to find shelter before it hits." Madeline nodded, pulling her coat tighter. "How far to the nearest town?" "Too far, but there's an old line shack about an hour east of here. Used it during cattle drives years back." He adjusted their course, leading them through a narrow valley. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the small cabin came into view, a simple structure built against the side of a hill for protection from the elements. They reached it just as the heavens opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Inside, the shack was dusty but sound. A small wood stove stood in one corner, and rough bunks lined one wall. Bryce quickly got a fire going while Madeline arranged their damp bedrolls near the stove to dry. "Looks like we're here for the night," Bryce said, watching the rain lash against the single window. "Storm like this could bring down trees across the trails." Madeline nodded, settling onto one of the bunks. "At least we're dry." She pulled a small journal from her saddlebag and began leafing through it. "That your evidence?" Bryce asked, curious despite himself. "Part of it." She hesitated, then held it out to him. "See for yourself." Bryce took the journal and began reading. It contained meticulous notes, dates, shipments, payments, names. The systematic fraud was laid out in black and white, along with details of bribes to officials and threats to those who raised concerns. "This is..." Bryce looked up at her with new respect. "This is thorough." "I was his personal secretary for 2 years," Madeline explained. "At first, I didn't understand what I was recording. By the time I realized, I was already complicit by my silence." Her voice dropped. "After Silverton, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. So you took these records and ran." She nodded. "I have more letters, receipts hidden in a lockbox I shipped ahead to a friend in Sterling. I was planning to retrieve it before going to the authorities." The coincidence seemed too convenient. "This friend in Sterling, who are they?" "Reverend Thomas Whitaker. He was my father's friend before he became a minister. I trust him completely." The name was familiar to Bryce. Whitaker had a reputation for integrity throughout the region. If he was involved, perhaps Madeline's story was exactly as she presented it. The storm raged through the night, wind howling around the small cabin. Despite the close quarters, they maintained a careful distance, Madeline on one bunk and Bryce on the other. But in the confined space, conversation was inevitable. "How long have you been alone, Bryce?" Madeline asked as they shared a simple meal of beans and coffee. He considered deflecting the question but found himself answering truthfully. 5 years on my own at the ranch. Before that, I drifted for a while after." He stopped, unwilling to complete the thought. "After what?" She prompted gently. Bryce set down his tin cup. "There was a woman, Sarah. We were to be married." The words felt strange in his mouth after so many years of silence. "There was a fire in town, the boarding house where she stayed. She didn't make it out." "I'm sorry," Madeline said softly. "That's a terrible loss. It was a long time ago." Bryce stood and moved to the window, watching the rain. "After that, I decided second chances weren't for me. Easier to be alone than to lose someone again." "Is that why you helped me? Because you felt you had nothing left to lose?" The question was perceptive, cutting closer to the truth than he was comfortable admitting. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do, and because Blake needs to answer for what he's done." Madeline didn't press further, and for that, Bryce was grateful. They spent the rest of the evening in companionable silence, the storm gradually diminishing to a steady rain. Morning brought clearing skies and muddy trails. They set out early, picking their way carefully through terrain made treacherous by the night's downpour. Progress was slow but steady, and by afternoon they had covered significant ground. As they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, Bryce reined in his horse. "Something's not right," he murmured, scanning the landscape below. "What is it?" Madeline asked, moving her mount beside his. "Smoke. Too much for a campfire." He pointed to a thin gray plume rising from the trees about 2 miles ahead, "and it's right along our route." "Could be travelers," Madeline suggested, though her tone betrayed her doubt. "Maybe." Bryce dismounted. "Wait here, I'm going to have a closer look." Before she could protest, he had disappeared into the brush, moving silently with the skill of a lifelong hunter. Madeline waited anxiously, the minutes stretching interminably until he finally returned, his expression grim. 6 men, he reported, swinging back into the saddle. "Carter and his 2 from before, plus 3 more. They've set up camp right on the trail to Sterling." Madeline paled. "How did they know we'd be coming this way?" "They don't, not for certain, but they're watching the most direct route." Bryce turned his horse away from the ridge. "We'll have to go around. Adds a day to our journey, but better than riding into an ambush." They backtracked to a narrow game trail that led east before curving north again. The path was barely visible in places, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through particularly dense sections of forest. "How did you know about this trail?" Madeline asked as they navigated a rocky stretch. Used to hunt these mountains with my father, Bryce replied. He knew every deer path and creek bed from here to the Wyoming line. They made camp that night in a small cave formed by an overhang of rock, building only the smallest of fires to avoid detection. The close quarters seemed even more intimate than the line shack, perhaps because they had now shared parts of their histories with each other. "Tell me about Denver," Bryce said as they huddled near the fire. "What was your life like before Blake?" Madeline seemed surprised by his interest. "Ordinary, mostly. My father was a schoolteacher. After he and my mother died, I finished my education at a ladies' academy in Boston. My father had set aside money for that. When I returned to Denver, I needed work," she sighed. "Blake offered twice what other positions paid. I was grateful at first." "When did you realize what he was involved in?" "Gradually. Small discrepancies in the books at first, then overheard conversations. By the time I understood the full extent, I felt trapped. I knew too much to be allowed to simply leave." She stared into the flames. "After Silverton, I couldn't be part of it anymore, no matter the risk." "Brave decision," Bryce commented. "Most would have looked the other way, like I had been doing." She shook her head. "I'm not brave, Bryce. I was complicit through my silence. This is my attempt at atonement." Her honesty was disarming. Most people Bryce had known in his life constructed narratives that cast themselves in the most favorable light. Madeline's willingness to acknowledge her failings spoke to a character he'd rarely encountered. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "I'll take first watch." The following day brought them to a small settlement little more than a trading post and a few scattered cabins. Bryce approached cautiously, wary of strangers, but the need for supplies outweighed his caution. The trader, an elderly man with rheumy eyes and a weathered face, regarded them with mild interest as they selected basic provisions. "Don't get many travelers this way," he commented. "You folks lost." "Just taking the scenic route," Bryce replied noncommittally. The old man nodded. "Well, you might want to be careful heading north. Had some rough-looking characters through here yesterday, asking about a man and woman traveling together. Seemed mighty interested in finding you." Bryce and Madeline exchanged glances. "Appreciate the warning," Bryce said, placing extra coins on the counter. "Any chance there's another route to Sterling from here?" "Might be," the trader said, pocketing the money. "Old Mining Road heads northeast about 3 miles from here, follows the river for a spell before cutting west again. Adds half a day to your journey, but it's less traveled." Armed with this information and fresh supplies, they set out immediately, pushing harder now that they knew Carter and his men were actively searching the area. The mining road was overgrown in places but still passable, winding alongside a swift-flowing river before climbing into higher elevations. By nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the trading post. They made camp in a dense stand of pines, foregoing a fire despite the chill in the air. As they sat wrapped in blankets, sharing cold rations, Bryce found himself studying Madeline in the fading light, the determined set of her jaw, the graceful line of her neck, the strength evident in her posture despite days of hard travel. "We should reach Sterling by tomorrow evening," he said, breaking the silence. "Assuming the weather holds and we don't run into more trouble," Madeline nodded, "and then you present your evidence to Marshal Hayes and we see what happens." Bryce hesitated. "After that?" "I suppose you'll need to decide your next move." "And you?" she asked quietly. "Will you return to your ranch?" The question gave him pause. Until this moment, he hadn't considered any alternative. His ranch was his refuge, his solitude a carefully constructed defense against further loss. Yet the prospect of returning to that empty existence held less appeal than it had a week ago. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Depends on how things play out with Blake, I suppose." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with unspoken possibilities rather than careful distance. When they finally settled for sleep, Bryce found himself acutely aware of Madeline's presence just a few feet away, her steady breathing a counterpoint to the wild beating of his own heart. Dawn broke clear and cold. They rose in silence, efficiently breaking camp and resuming their journey. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed, the trail narrowing to a precarious ledge in places. Bryce led the way, frequently looking back to ensure Madeline was navigating safely. By midday, they had reached the summit and began the descent toward Sterling. The town was visible in the distance, a collection of buildings nestled in a broad valley. The sight should have brought relief, but Bryce felt an inexplicable tension building within him. Soon their journey together would end. Madeline would pursue her justice, and he still didn't know what came next. They stopped to rest the horses near a small spring. As Madeline knelt to fill their canteens, the crack of a rifle split the air. Dirt kicked up inches from her hand. "Down," Bryce shouted, drawing his Winchester and scanning the rocks above them. Another shot rang out, this one splintering a branch overhead. Madeline scrambled behind a boulder, eyes wide but focused. Bryce moved to cover, eyes searching for the shooter. Movement caught his attention, a flash of color against the gray stone about 100 yards up the slope. "Stay here," he ordered, then darted between boulders, working his way up and around to flank the position. The shooter focused on Madeline's hiding place, never saw him coming. Bryce emerged from behind a stand of scrub pine, rifle leveled. "Drop it," he commanded. The man, one of Carter's associates from the camp, froze, then slowly lowered his weapon. "Just following orders," he said with a smirk. "Blake's paying good money to find that woman." "And to kill her?" Bryce asked coldly. "Dead or alive was the instruction." The man shrugged. "Dead's easier to transport." Anger surged through Bryce, but he kept his voice steady. "You're going to walk down to those horses, and then you're going to ride back to Carter with a message. Anyone who comes after Madeline Darnell deals with me." The man's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you?" "Bryce Keller." Recognition flashed in the man's eyes. Even after 5 years, Bryce's reputation as one of the deadliest marksmen in Colorado evidently persisted. "Keller, thought you'd disappeared." "I did, now I'm back." Bryce gestured with his rifle. "Move." They descended to where Madeline waited, tension evident in her posture, until she saw Bryce had the situation under control. The gunman mounted his horse under Bryce's watchful eye. "Tell Carter we'll be expecting him if he follows," Bryce said. "And tell Blake his days of killing miners for profit are over." As the man rode away, Madeline approached Bryce, concern etched on her face. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he replied tersely. "But we need to move. He won't be the last." They rode hard for Sterling, pushing the horses as much as they dared on the treacherous trail. The sun was setting by the time they reached the outskirts of town, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Sterling was larger than Black Hawk, a supply center for surrounding ranches and mines. Bryce led them directly to the marshal's office, a solid brick building near the town center. Inside, they found Marshal James Hayes at his desk, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker side. "Keller," Hayes stood, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Thought you'd sworn off civilization." "Circumstances change, Jim." Bryce gestured to Madeline. "This is Madeline Darnell. She has information about Carson Blake that you need to hear." Hayes's expression grew serious. "Blake, the Denver businessman." He motioned them to seats. "This sounds like a conversation that requires privacy." Over the next hour, Madeline laid out her evidence, the journal entries, the pattern of fraud, the connection to mining disasters, including Silverton. Hayes listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing her to present her case uninterrupted. "This is substantial," he said finally, "but Blake has powerful friends. Taking action against him won't be simple." "We need to retrieve the rest of my documentation," Madeline explained. "I sent a package to Reverend Whitaker for safekeeping." Hayes nodded. "Thomas is a good man." "His church is on the north end of town." He paused, considering. "Blake's men are likely already in Sterling or on their way. You'll need a safe place to stay while we sort this out." "They can stay with me," a voice said from the doorway. They turned to find a woman in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver, watching them with intelligent eyes. "Martha," Hayes said with a smile. "Eavesdropping again." Someone has to keep you honest, James. She entered, extending a hand to Madeline. Martha Hayes. My husband doesn't introduce me properly because he thinks I should be at home knitting instead of involving myself in his work. Because I worry, Hayes corrected with the patience of a long-standing disagreement. Martha was a nurse during the war. Now she involves herself in everything from town council meetings to taking in strays, human and animal alike. Our home has plenty of room, Martha said, and it's the last place Blake's men will look. James has spent years ensuring our connection remains private for precisely these situations. Bryce raised an eyebrow at Hayes, who shrugged. Separating personal from professional keeps potential targets safe. Martha's maiden name is Wilson. The house is in her name. Few people know she's my wife. It's settled then, Martha declared. You'll stay with me while James investigates. We'll retrieve your documentation from Reverend Whittaker in the morning. Despite his exhaustion, Bryce found himself reluctant to agree. Staying in town, accepting help from others, these were things he'd avoided for years. But Madeline needed protection, and the evidence needed safeguarding. Just until this is resolved, he conceded finally. Martha's home proved to be a spacious two-story house on the edge of town, surrounded by a well-tended garden. Inside, it was comfortable and welcoming, with polished floors and simple, elegant furnishings. The guest rooms are upstairs, Martha informed them as she prepared a late supper. You both look dead on your feet. Eat, then rest. Everything else can wait until morning. The meal was the first proper food they'd had in days: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread. They ate gratefully, too tired for much conversation. Afterward, Martha showed them to adjacent rooms upstairs, providing clean towels and fresh water for washing. Thank you for your hospitality, Madeline said sincerely. We've imposed on your kindness without warning. Nonsense, Martha replied with a warm smile. Any friend of James is welcome here, and anyone brave enough to stand against men like Blake deserves all the help we can provide. She turned to Bryce. That includes you, Mr. Keller. James has spoken of you often over the years. Has he? Bryce was surprised. He admires your principles, if not your tendency toward solitude. Martha's eyes twinkled. Rest well. Tomorrow may prove challenging. Left alone in his room, Bryce sank onto the edge of the bed, the comfort of it almost foreign after so many nights on the trail. Through the wall, he could hear Madeline moving about her room, the soft splash of water, the creak of floorboards. The awareness of her proximity stirred emotions he'd long suppressed. Sleep eluded him despite his exhaustion. After an hour of staring at the ceiling, he rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the quiet street below. Sterling slept, unaware of the conflict brewing within its boundaries. Tomorrow would bring confrontation with Blake's men, with authorities, perhaps with Blake himself if Hayes's investigation progressed quickly, and after that, the question persisted. What came next for Bryce Keller? A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Madeline standing there, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a borrowed nightdress with a shawl wrapped around her for modesty. I couldn't sleep, she said quietly. May I come in? Bryce hesitated, then stepped aside. She entered, moving to stand beside him at the window. Are you afraid? He asked after a moment. Yes, she admitted. Not of Blake or his men, but of failing, of all this being for nothing. Hayes is a good lawman. If there's justice to be had, he'll find it. She turned to face him. And you? Will you stay to see it through? The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond the immediate situation. Bryce found himself unable to look away from her eyes, green and searching in the dim light. I came this far, he said finally. That's not an answer. Her voice was soft but insistent. I don't have one yet. He moved away from the window, creating distance between them. 5 years ago, I decided the world had nothing left to offer me. That solitude was preferable to the alternative. And now, the directness of her gaze unnerved him. Now I'm not so certain, she stepped closer. Because of justice for your brother, not just that. The admission cost him something, a piece of the armor he'd constructed around himself. Madeline reached out, her hand hovering inches from his face before she let it fall away. I should go back to my room, she said, though she made no move to leave. You should, Bryce agreed, equally stationary, the moment stretched between them taut with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Madeline nodded and turned toward the door. "Good night, Bryce. Good night, Madeline." He watched her go, feeling as though something essential had slipped through his fingers. But what that something was, he couldn't yet name. Morning brought clarity in the form of action. Hayes arrived early, bringing news that Jeb Carter and his men had indeed been spotted on the outskirts of Sterling. "They're being discreet for now," Hayes reported over breakfast. "Asking questions, not making trouble, but they'll find you eventually." "Then we need to move quickly," Madeline said. "The sooner we secure the evidence and present our case, the better," Hayes nodded. "I've sent a telegram to the federal marshal in Denver. He's been looking for grounds to investigate Blake for months. Your evidence could be the key." "What about Reverend Whitaker?" Bryce asked. "Is it safe to approach him?" "Thomas is expecting us," Martha interjected. "I sent a note round first thing. He'll meet us at the church in an hour." They set out as planned, Hayes accompanying them to the small white church on the north side of town. Inside, they found Reverend Whitaker, a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a scholarly demeanor, waiting in his study. "Madeline," he greeted her warmly. "Your letter said only that you needed a safe place for your package. I had no idea you were in such danger." "I couldn't risk putting the details in writing," she explained. "Do you still have what I sent, of course?" He moved to a painting on the wall, swinging it aside to reveal a small safe. After turning the combination, he withdrew a metal lockbox and handed it to Madeline. "I've kept it secure, as promised." Madeline opened the box, revealing a stack of documents, letters, receipts, ledger pages. "It's all here," she confirmed, relief evident in her voice. Hayes examined the materials, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is damning," he said finally. "Corruption on a scale that's hard to comprehend, and the lives lost." He looked up at Madeline. "You've taken an enormous risk bringing this forward." "It was the only choice I could live with," she replied simply. They were preparing to leave when the church door opened. Bryce tensed, hand moving to his sidearm, but it was only the church caretaker. "Reverend," the elderly man said urgently, "there are men outside, armed men asking about visitors." Hayes moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. "Carter and 4 others," he reported. "They've got the church surrounded." "Is there another way out?" Bryce asked Whitaker. The Reverend nodded. "The cellar connects to the old mission building next door. We could exit through there, but they'll likely see us crossing to the street." "We need a distraction," Hayes said, thinking aloud. "Something to draw them away from that side of the building." "I can help with that," Martha offered. At her husband's concerned look, she added, "Nothing dangerous, James, just a bit of misdirection." While Martha slipped out through the cellar passage, the others gathered the evidence and prepared to follow. Minutes later, shouts erupted from the street, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. "Now," Hayes ordered, leading them through the cellar and into the adjacent building. They emerged onto a side street just as a crowd began to gather around the main entrance of the church, drawn by the commotion. "What did she do?" Madeline whispered as they hurried toward the marshal's office. Hayes smiled grimly. "Knowing Martha, something effective and completely unexpected." They reached the office without incident, finding Martha already waiting inside, a satisfied expression on her face. "The fire brigade should be dousing Carter's men about now," she explained. "Amazing how quickly they respond when someone shouts fire near the bank." "You're a dangerous woman, Martha Hayes," her husband said with reluctant admiration. "Only when necessary, dear." She turned to Bryce and Madeline. "But they won't be distracted for long. What's our next move?" Hayes was sorting through the evidence, organizing it for presentation. "Federal marshal should arrive on tomorrow morning's train. Until then, we keep this secure and you two out of sight." He looked up at Bryce. "I'd appreciate your help watching the office tonight. Blake's men might try to retrieve this evidence before we can act on it." "Of course," Bryce agreed, though the prospect of remaining in town, involving himself further in official matters, went against every instinct he'd cultivated over the past 5 years. Madeline touched his arm lightly. "You don't have to stay. You've done more than enough already." The gesture, simple as it was, sent warmth spreading through him. "I'm seeing this through," he said with more certainty than he'd felt about anything in years. They spent the day at the marshal's office, Hayes methodically documenting the evidence while Bryce kept watch from the window. Carter and his men eventually regrouped, taking rooms at the hotel across the street and establishing a clear surveillance of the marshal's office. "They're waiting for reinforcements," Bryce observed as dusk fell. "Or for us to make a move," Hayes nodded. "Blake probably has men on the way from Denver. We need to hold out until morning." Martha returned home to prepare supplies for what might be a long night. Madeline remained with Bryce and Hayes, her determination undiminished despite the visible fatigue in her posture. As night settled over Sterling, the tension in the small office grew palpable. Hayes had deputized 2 trusted townsmen to patrol the streets, but they were outnumbered by Blake's men. "You should try to rest," Bryce told Madeline as she stared out at the darkened street. "Tomorrow will be challenging." She turned to him, the lamplight casting her face in soft shadows. "I keep thinking about what happens after, if we succeed, if Blake faces justice. What then? I can't return to Denver, my life there is over." "You could start fresh," Bryce suggested. "Somewhere new." "Alone." The word held a question he wasn't ready to answer. Before he could respond, a rock crashed through the window, narrowly missing Madeline. A piece of paper was wrapped around it, secured with string. Hayes retrieved it, unfolding the message with a frown. "Send out the woman and the evidence by midnight or we burn the town," he read aloud. "Signed by Carter." "Empty threat," Bryce said immediately. "Even Blake wouldn't authorize destroying a whole town." "Probably," Hayes agreed. "But Carter might act on his own initiative, especially if he's desperate. We need to be prepared for anything." The hours ticked by with excruciating slowness. At 11:30, Martha returned with food and coffee, reporting increased activity at the hotel where Carter's men were staying. "They're saddling horses," she informed them. "At least 6 men that I could see." Hayes checked his weapons. "They're making their move before the federal marshal arrives. We need to be ready." Bryce positioned himself at the front window, Winchester ready. Madeline and Martha took positions at the rear of the office, armed with Hayes's spare revolvers. The marshal himself stood at the door, badge displayed prominently on his chest. Midnight came and went without incident. Then, just as tension began to ease slightly, a shot rang out from the direction of the hotel. The bullet embedded itself in the doorframe of the marshal's office. "That's their answer," Hayes said grimly. What followed was a standoff that stretched through the night. Carter's men maintained positions around the office, occasionally firing to keep them pinned down. Hayes and Bryce returned fire sparingly, conscious of their limited ammunition and the danger to innocent townspeople. As dawn approached, Martha spotted movement at the edge of town, riders approaching from the east. "James," she called urgently, "someone's coming." Hayes moved to the window, watching as the riders drew closer. A slow smile spread across his face. "That's not Blake's reinforcements," he said with satisfaction. "That's the federal marshal, and he's brought help." The arrival of Federal Marshal Wilson and his deputies shifted the balance decisively. Carter and his men, realizing they were now outnumbered, attempted to flee but were quickly apprehended. By mid-morning, the immediate danger had passed. Marshal Wilson, a stern-faced man with a reputation for incorruptibility, reviewed the evidence with growing outrage. "This is enough to bring Blake down," he confirmed. "Not just criminal charges, this will destroy him politically and financially as well." "Will Madeline be safe?" Bryce asked, the question foremost in his mind. "We'll need her testimony," Wilson acknowledged. "But after that, yes. The government can arrange protection if necessary, perhaps even a new identity in another state." Madeline, who had been listening quietly, shook her head. "I don't want to disappear. I've been hiding long enough." She looked at Bryce. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it openly." The federal marshal departed for Denver that afternoon, taking the evidence and 4 deputies to arrest Carson Blake. Hayes insisted Madeline and Bryce remain in Sterling until confirmation of Blake's arrest, concerned that some of his men might still be in the area. That evening, they gathered at Martha and James's home, the atmosphere lighter now that the immediate threat had passed. Over dinner, conversation turned to the future. "What will you do now, Miss Darnell?" Martha asked. "Once this is truly over," Madeline considered the question. "I'm not entirely sure. I have some savings. Perhaps I'll look for a teaching position somewhere." "Sterling could use another teacher," Martha suggested. "Our school has grown considerably this past year." Bryce, who had been quiet throughout the meal, found himself suddenly anxious at the thought of Madeline settling in Sterling, both because it meant she would stay, and because it meant she would build a life that might not include him. After dinner, as Martha cleared the dishes with Hayes's help, Bryce and Madeline stepped onto the porch. The night was clear, stars brilliant in the vast Colorado sky. "Will you return to your ranch?" Madeline asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I've been asking myself that same question," Bryce admitted. "A week ago, the answer would have been simple. Now, she prompted when he didn't continue. Bryce turned to face her, finding courage in the darkness. "Now I'm not sure solitude is what I want anymore." Madeline stepped closer. "What do you want, Bryce?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Bryce thought of his ranch, the solitude he'd once craved now seeming empty rather than peaceful. He thought of Sarah, lost to him years ago, and the vow he'd made never to risk that kind of pain again. Then he looked at Madeline, her courage, her determination, her quiet strength. In the short time he'd known her, she had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. "A second chance," he said finally, "if that's still possible." Madeline's smile was radiant even in the dim light. "I believe it is, for both of us." She reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his. The contact was simple but profound, a connection he'd denied himself for too long. Bryce drew her closer, his free hand coming up to touch her cheek. "I'm not good at this," he warned. "It's been a long time." "We'll figure it out together," she assured him. Their first kiss was tentative, a careful exploration. The second was not. When they finally parted, Bryce felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope, bright and undeniable. News arrived the following day that Carson Blake had been arrested in Denver, his offices searched, and additional evidence of corruption discovered. The immediate danger had passed, though Marshal Wilson warned that the legal proceedings would take time. "You'll need to testify eventually," he told Madeline during a brief visit to Sterling, "but that could be months from now. Until then, you're free to go where you please." That evening, Bryce and Madeline walked along the edge of town, discussing possibilities for their futures separately and perhaps together. "I could stay in Sterling," Madeline suggested. "Martha says there's need for a teacher. It seems like a good community." "It is," Bryce agreed. "Hayes is a good man, keeps the town safe. People here mind their business but help when needed." "And your ranch?" she asked. "Would you sell it?" Bryce considered the question. The ranch had been his refuge, his escape from a world that had taken too much from him. But now it represented isolation rather than peace. "Not sell," he said finally, "but maybe change it, make it something different than what it's been." "Different how?" He stopped walking, turning to face her. "The land is good. With some work, it could support more cattle. Maybe even a horse breeding operation. There's a creek that runs year-round, enough water for crops too." "That sounds like quite an undertaking for one person," Madeline observed, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "It is," he acknowledged. "Too much for one person." "But with the right partner." The word hung between them, full of promise and possibility. "Partner," Madeline echoed, stepping closer. "Is that what you're offering Bryce Keller for now?" he said carefully, "with the possibility of more if that's something you might want." Her smile was answer enough, but she gave him words as well. "I think I'd like to see this ranch of yours, to consider this partnership properly." 3 days later, they rode out of Sterling together, heading south toward Black Hawk. The journey that had once been fraught with danger now felt like the beginning of something new. They traveled at an easy pace, no longer pursued, taking time to appreciate the beauty of the mountains and each other's company. When they crested the final ridge overlooking Bryce's ranch, he reined in his horse, suddenly nervous about what Madeline would think of the modest homestead he'd built. "It's not much," he began, but Madeline interrupted him. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely, taking in the small cabin nestled against the hillside, the barn and corrals, the creek winding through the valley below. "I can see why you chose this place." The cabin seemed different when they entered it together, smaller, perhaps, but also warmer somehow. Bryce watched as Madeline moved through the rooms, running her hand over the table he'd built, examining the bookshelves, pausing at the mantel where the face-down photograph still rested. With gentle fingers, she lifted the frame, looking at the image of Sarah that Bryce had hidden away for so long. "She was beautiful," Madeline said softly. "She was," Bryce agreed, coming to stand beside her, "but that's the past." He took the photograph and returned it to the mantel, this time setting it upright. "It's time to look forward now." Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm together. Madeline proved adept at ranch work, learning quickly and bringing her own ideas to their partnership. They expanded the garden, repaired fencing, and planned for additional cattle come spring. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset or read aloud from the books that now saw regular use. Occasionally, they rode into Black Hawk for supplies. The first time, Bryce tensed as they approached the town he'd avoided for so long. But with Madeline beside him, the memories that had haunted him for years seemed less sharp, the pain more distant. Word of their partnership and growing relationship spread quickly through the small community. Some were surprised to see Bryce Keller re-engaging with the world. Others, particularly those who remembered him from before his self-imposed exile, were pleased to see the change in him. A month into their new arrangement, a letter arrived from Marshal Hayes. Blake's trial had been set for the spring, and Madeline would need to testify. The news brought a temporary shadow over their happiness, a reminder that the past wasn't entirely behind them. "I'll go with you," Bryce said immediately. "You won't face this alone." Madeline's gratitude was evident in her embrace. "I know, that's what partners do, isn't it? Face challenges together." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, their partnership deepened into something more. The spare room Madeline had initially occupied gradually emptied as her belongings migrated to Bryce's room. Their conversations turned to longer-term plans, expanding the house, increasing their herd, perhaps even starting a family someday. On a crisp October evening, as they sat before the fire after a day of hard work preparing for winter, Bryce reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks," he admitted, waiting for the right moment. Madeline's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "I'm not good with words," Bryce said, taking her hand. "But I know what I want now, a life with you, Madeline, if you'll have me." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you, Bryce Keller?" "I am." He met her gaze steadily. "I never thought I'd want this again, never thought I'd find someone who could make me believe in second chances. Then you knocked on my door twice and everything changed." Madeline laughed through her tears. "The first time wasn't exactly knocking. I collapsed on your porch, as I recall." "Close enough," he smiled. "Will you marry me, Madeline?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will." They were married in Sterling that December, with Marshal Hayes officiating and Martha standing witness. The ceremony was small but joyful, a celebration of not just their love but the new life they had built together from the ashes of their separate pasts. Spring brought Blake's trial, as promised. Madeline testified with Bryce at her side, her clear account of the corruption and its deadly consequences leaving no room for doubt. The verdict, when it came, was just: Blake would spend the rest of his life in prison, his fortune confiscated, his political aspirations destroyed. "It's really over," Madeline said as they left the Denver courthouse for the last time. "We can truly move forward now," and move forward they did. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, first a son, Daniel, named for Bryce's brother, and 2 years later a daughter they called Elizabeth, after Madeline's mother. 5 years after that first fateful meeting, on the anniversary of the day Madeline had collapsed on his porch, Bryce stood in that same spot, watching his wife hang laundry while their children played near the creek. The ranch had transformed. More cattle now grazed the expanded pastures, a small orchard was beginning to bear fruit, and the cabin had grown into a proper home. "What are you thinking about?" Madeline asked, coming to stand beside him. At 31, she was more beautiful to him than ever, her face lined now with laugh lines rather than worry. "About second chances," Bryce replied, drawing her into his arms. "About how lucky I am that you knocked on my door. Collapsed on your porch," she corrected with a smile. "The details aren't important," he said, kissing her lightly. "What matters is that you came back, that you knocked twice." "Best decision I ever made," Madeline murmured against his lips. As their children's laughter echoed across the valley, Bryce Keller, once determined to live and die alone, gave thanks for the twist of fate that had brought Madeline to his door. The path hadn't been easy, but the journey had led them here to a life richer and more fulfilling than either had dared to hope for. For a man who hadn't believed in second chances, he had been granted the greatest one of all, the chance to love again, to build a family, to heal. And as he held his wife in his arms, watching their children play in the shadow of the Colorado mountains, Bryce knew with absolute certainty that some doors, once opened, were never meant to be closed again.